Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight to this. That's all right. I did that like 3 times. My name is Jason Martin. I'm the Dean of the Evans Library. I guess I'm still technically the new Dean. I started in August. And so thank you for coming out tonight. This has been a special year. This is the Evans Library's 40th anniversary. We're the 3rd library on campus, and we've been here for 40 years. And so we've been doing a lot to celebrate. We're going to do it the whole year. We're going to have a party, not just one day. And so we've been putting on a lot of events, and this one kind of came into us a little bit later in the year. We thought it was a great opportunity to show off some of our great faculty and have a really fascinating discussion that impacts all of us and really how we live our lives. And you might not realize it, but algorithms are everywhere and influence you all the time, from the music you listen to websites you visit, to all sorts of things. And we're going to talk a lot about that tonight here. So what we're going to do, each panelist will have about a 10-minute presentation with some slides, and then on their particular area, and I'll talk about that in a second, and then we'll open it up for some general discussion and questions and comments and the like, and you can learn from their wealth of knowledge and expertise. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce our august panel. Dr. Siddhartha Bhattacharya, or SID, Assist Research Lab, focuses on research in the design of innovative formal methods, machine learning engineering, and model-based engineering to characterize intelligent systems for safety and correctness. Before joining Florida Tech, he had been a senior research engineer at Rockwell Collins Advanced Technology Center, a summer research fellow at Applied Research Laboratory at Penn State, and a summer faculty fellow at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. His research has been funded by NASA and the DoD, and research products from his lab have been developed in collaboration with industry and academia. Dr. Tejas Chanagiri, or Dr. C, is an assistant professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at the Fisk College of Business. He earned a PhD in strategic management at the Gayton College of Business at the University of Kentucky, and pursued a postdoctoral fellowship in strategic management and entrepreneurship at the Warrington College of Business at the University of Florida. His postdoctoral fellowship was partly funded by Apple, Meta, AT&T, and the Charles Koch Foundation. He also pursued a 1-year full-time fellowship in the organization Science and Analytics practice at McKinsey & Company. And prior to his PhD, Dr. C earned a bachelor's degree in physics and mathematics, a master's degree in computer science, and an MBA. He also worked in the technology consulting sector for several years. Dr. C's research, teaching, service, and industry engagement is focused on strategy in a context of high-growth entrepreneurship, technology, and innovation. Dr. Modi Mizrahi is professor of philosophy with expertise in the philosophy of science and technology at Florida Tech, where he teaches artificial intelligence ethics, bioethics, engineering ethics, and philosophy of science regularly. He received his PhD in philosophy from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in 2010. His books include The Kuhnian Image of Science, Time for Decisive Transformation, The Relativity of Theory, Key Positions and Arguments in the Contemporary Scientific Realism, Anti-Realism Debate, and For and Against Scientism, Science, Methodology, and the Future of Philosophy. Dr. Anna Mutrath is assistant professor at Florida Tech. Her research interests include 20th and 21st century literature, theories of world literature, and cultural production, literary sociology, translation studies, print culture, media studies, and book history. She is the author of Making World Literature, Actors, Institutions, and Networks in the United States since 1890, and Selling Books with Algorithms. Her work has appeared in the Journal of World Literature, Book History, American Literature, and College Literature. Without further ado, I will let our panel take over, and I do believe that Sid is going to start us off.
Sorry, yeah.
Just trigger with a sign on this. Okay, welcome everyone. So I'm Sid, and I'm going to talk about within algorithms and us, kind of looking into challenges of as these algorithms start including more intelligence or machine learning within them. Okay, and that's kind of the focus of some of the courses that I teach, as well as the research that comes out of our lab. So, as part of some of the challenges that we need to understand, comparing traditional programming with as machine learning based software as getting introduced in the real world applications like autonomous cars, autonomous drones, and for day-to-day IoT devices. So, in the case of traditional programming, we have specific requirements. Based on specific requirements, we come up with algorithms or pseudocodes, which are very specific in nature, where we can say, if this happens, if the sensor value is such and such, if it is bright sunlight, then maybe as the aircraft is landing, slow down because you're not able to see properly. That algorithm changes to code. So we know from the pseudocode what we are writing, whether it's Python, C, C++, doesn't matter. We know what are the lines of code that we need to write to represent that action from the software. So that starts becoming the software package where eventually the software gets developed. So a human is developing that software, right? As part of traditional programming, we know given the inputs, we get the result. Now, what happens when we have machine learning in them? The requirements are not as specific. It changes to more like objectives, where Netflix might say, oh, I need a recommendation system that increases my subscribers. How do you represent that as a requirement? That becomes challenging because it's no longer if then else. You're now looking into a lot of features and trying to understand a pattern based on which you're trying to decide, oh, how can I increase my subscribers, right? And so in this case here, we do a research where we went on the aircraft at the Melbourne Airport and Granville Carrier and collect data as in from cameras to then predict, can the aircraft follow the lane? What are some of the contingencies we might get into? In doing so, from the objectives, what we need to start doing is start collecting data. And what you see at that image is bright sunlight in the morning and the aircraft is trying to land. Looking at that, oh, where is that line? That becomes very difficult to identify. So as part of the machine learning process, it changes to, we need to collect data based on the objective. We need to perform data engineering such that then the machine learning model will be able to understand, oh, here is the lane, here is the line, this is what I need to follow. I don't care about the rest of it, right? So through data engineering, trying to prepare that data, then creating that model is become less and less, more it's getting into model selection because there are a lot of machine learning models that exist. And so the concept of transfer learning is becoming more popular where you are using already existing model and you're training it for a new domain, sharing the knowledge. It's kind of like you trained a machine learning model to play piano, now you want it to play violin. What is same? The music theory. But how you play is different, right? So that shared knowledge remains and passes on from the model to the next and trying to understand what would be the shared information and what we might need to change. So model selection becomes the next step. Then we get into training and testing. As a result, what changes is within the model, the weights, how they are connected remains the same, but the values of weight changes. Who changes that? The data. So the human is not changing that anymore. So we need to understand that. Earlier in traditional programming, the human was adding those requirements. So now we don't even know, oh, why did that weight change? Because all the connections have now different weights. And it's better predicting that image to follow the lines. So that becomes much more challenging. As a result, yes, we have the input, now the software is replaced with the machine learning model, we get the results, but we don't very well understand why it is responding better, and so there is a lot of theoretical work going on trying to understand what is that shared piece of information. Can we freeze some layers to understand where it got stored so that we can then understand how to save it, store it as we continue with that effort. So next, moving into the next challenge, complexity in engineering systems, right? So we are implementing and we want more machine learning based algorithms to be integrated because they have advantages, they are beneficial, but we have to be cautious in approaching them because we don't understand the outcome. Its strength is also its weakness, right? Strength is it can predict something you have not coded in there, but weakness is what if it predicts something wrong? And that is where we have to be careful about. So complexity in engineering systems, yes, we have aircrafts and we have automobiles that have 30,000 to 40,000 parts. Aircrafts have 6,340,000 parts. Microsoft Office has 100 million lines of code. So we have built larger systems, but they use more of the traditional approach where traditional systems engineering principles such as that of abstraction, reuse, composition work, which is where we are challenged when we start including machine learning, because that idea of abstraction where you are trying to bring it at a higher level does not work well, because you cannot divide that machine learning model into parts and then start thinking, oh, this helps me solve that particular task. Rather, we need that whole model to perform that task. So the concepts apply to machine learning based systems, system engineering concepts, most likely not. So that is also evolving, right? Then challenges in establishing contracts. So contracts, as we know, right, where we are saying, oh, given this function, this software, it will do that work. And when it fails, we know where exactly to assign the blame, because we know that function was built, in this case, this was shortest distance first algorithm, or if it is not able to give the shortest distance, we know exactly we need to get to this module, what lines of code need to be changed. Now, as part of identifying what errors occur, we can find the functionality, debug the code, make changes. But what happens in machine learning? What you see in these images, I don't know if this is not pointing, but the first one where it says camouflage, that's a person. So this was machine learning used to identify people in the images. And these were all the failures. Where there was a camouflage, it could not identify, the child was not identified when the child was in between adults. Then it thought that lady to be a tree as a result, because she was wearing during Christmas times green gown and bare legs, thought it to be tree. And so it didn't identify that lady as a person. The single lane controller, it did not identify that because he was standing with the stop sign and it could not identify. There is a person behind the column that could not be identified. Sun glare resulted in that person not being identified. So these are different failures, but we cannot assign the blame to particular few lines of code. When these failures occur, we need to provide new data set and try to train and hope it's going to work. And that's where we then test and see, did it work? Otherwise, we need to collect new data, and that's a whole lot of work. So what changes here is the contract changes. We cannot, with 100%, assign the blame to that piece of code. What we are changing to is saying, oh, it's going to work 99% of the time, or 95% of the time. So it's not that deterministic guarantee that we can provide. Then as part of capturing concept drifts, traditionally, new code base needed to be introduced for new concepts, right? New function, new code needs to be written by someone because we know, oh, this requirement has not been represented, right? So as a result, whenever the concept changes, that means we are trying to represent some function fx equal to y, that function represents a relationship between x and y. Whenever that changes, we have new code base traditionally. X and y might change over time. And what if f does not capture the relationship, right? So as we age from teenagers to being in the 40s and 60s, I might like different types or categories of movies or books. Those concepts are changing, right? And as a result, the machine learning needs to be trained on that new data set. Okay, and so we need to start looking into, oh, is it predicting correctly? If it is not, continuously we need to monitor and introduce those concept drifts. Okay, a primary example is in predicting criminal activities in an area. You have more police going on, making more arrests, and the machine learning thinks, oh, I'm doing good, send more police. But through that, it might be becoming better. Unless we change that data set and say, hey, it has become better, now you need to be trained on this changing concept, the machine learning will do wrong predictions. So we should be careful about how the concept drift occurs. How do we capture that traditionally by adding new code base? But does capturing concept drift change with machine learning? Yes, it does. And so now it's new data set we need. That means we need to train again, test it again, and that becomes, again, expensive as process. One other thing we need to be careful about is correlation versus causation. Machine learning models come up with correlation. It might not be the causation. Some models like Bayesian networks or symbolic AI capture causation. Right? Otherwise, machine learning models are coming up with, oh, how is X related to Y? But does X really cause Y? It's not capturing that, which is where we humans need to be involved as we come up with these features and try to represent that correlation and understand, is that causation? Okay, and so as part of that process, we need to start thinking about, does X correlate to Y? If it does not, what is the confounding variable? And that confounding variable needs to be introduced. So say, for example, there was a study long time back where it says, oh, drinking coffee leads to pancreatic cancer. When they looked back, they found all those that had cancer were also smokers. So the confounding variable there was smoking. As a result, when we are using machine learning, if we don't give that deeper thought, we might miss upon it, that what might be actually causing that issue. Same thing, study was done with degree from high-ranked schools gives high-paying jobs, but it missed, oh, maybe that major, that needs to be introduced to understand the high-paying job. So capturing causation, generally done through coding and internal conditions, but in the case of machine learning, it's more correlation. So we need to develop an understanding of, oh, we need to think about what is causing that. So finally, coming closer to my conclusion is that along with understanding these challenges, we also need to think about how do we present the intelligence, right? So one very strong approach is the machine learning does it for you. But you might not want that to happen all the time. You might want to know, why is the machine learning choosing to do or making that suggestion? So instead of automating, providing prompts, providing explanation, organizing an approach of showing sequentially what is going on and so what actions are expected, or annotating different design choices we need to explore, and we need to develop an understanding of when to use AI, machine learning, and when not to. Okay, and so when it is difficult for computers but easy for humans, where we identify objects, we are able to perform speech recognition. That's difficult for computers, but that's where, as we start training, developing models, it becomes better. Complex or unknown patterns, right? We have heard like several different genetic combinations were done for healthcare, through which they found new outcomes and results that were better. So trying to understand those patterns which are difficult for humans, and then obviously processing large amount of data. But just because AI is suitable doesn't mean we always need to use AI. That is where we need to think, analyze the potential risks of AI failures. Does it lead to loss of lives? If so, we need to rethink how to apply. Okay, and so we need to obviously assess the impacts and use AI only if the risks are manageable or low. Otherwise, we need to think about how we can architect them so that they are safe. So as a result, yes, we need to be aware of the challenges, understand what are the impacts, investigate and come up with research solutions that help us address those safety issues and challenges that might be there, and through public-private partnership, address these challenges. Okay, so that brings me to the conclusion of my slides. Thank you.
pages. This one? No.
The third one.
This one, yeah. Hey, good evening everyone. Thrilled to be on this panel, and I think I'm especially thrilled because looking at what Dr. Bhattacharya Dr. Bhattacharya's presentation, it looks like there's a lot of overlapping themes that we are concerned about, as I'll get to in my talk. First off, the field of strategy, which is essentially what I've spent the last 13 years studying, is concerned with just one question. Why are there performance differentials among firms? Businesses, we see all the time that lots of people start businesses, some of them do well, some of them not so well, some of them fail outright, some of them spectacularly successful. So the field of strategy attempts to understand in a scientific way, treating it as a science, whether there's a science behind why some businesses succeed and others fail. Now, there's a concept that's really central here, which kind of highlights why algorithms are important. There's an important difference between risk and uncertainty. So this was a difference that was highlighted over 100 years ago by an economist named Frank Knight. The difference is that with risk, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we know what the probability distribution of outcomes is. So if I'm tossing a coin, if I'm tossing it 100 times, I do know that on an average, I would expect to get heads 50 of those 100 times, give or take, if it's a fair coin. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I know what the probability distribution of outcomes is. Likewise, the roulette wheel at casinos, once again, you don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you do know the probability distribution of outcomes. Now, what makes our research question super complicated is that we are in a zone of uncertainty as opposed to risk, and I believe it's the same with many other academic fields generally. Uncertainty introduces a need for algorithmic approaches. Because if we are talking about just risk, which is where we know the probability distribution of outcomes, from a mathematical standpoint, it can always be reduced to a simple optimization problem. You don't need an algorithmic approach to solve it. But if I'm trying to predict Apple's stock price a year from now, which is one measure of a firm's performance is stock price. Now that really is in the uncertainty zone, because there I really have no clue whatsoever. There are so many variables that can impact the stock price of a company, and in such a complicated way that I'm pretty clueless to begin with. It's not like I know what the probability distribution of outcomes will be, and what I'm basically looking to do is to figure out the right approach. It should have been a much simpler problem. So because we are in the zone of uncertainty, algorithmic solutions are pretty much necessitated in tackling these and other similar questions. Before I get to the types of algorithmic solutions we use and their effectiveness, I just wanna say that risk and uncertainty, this distinction may be one of degree, because some have argued that even what we describe as uncertainty, it's not a complete blank piece of paper that we are looking at. We do know something about the problem. We may not know the exact probability distribution. So people have pointed out that maybe there is an element of risk there, what we are labeling uncertainty, and vice versa. In any case, most of the work the approaches I'm going to present are especially helpful when dealing with uncertainty, which is really what makes things complicated. So one way to tackle uncertainty is using machine learning. And as Dr. Bhattacharya pointed out, machine learning in its traditional form is a predictive model. Because you don't really know exactly why the algorithm is making that particular prediction, This is especially the case, I mean, if you're using deep learning or neural nets is really predictive by nature. It's not a model in its native form that helps you understand causality, even though it may be pretty effective at making predictions. Now, this is more, because this is a cross-disciplinary panel, I thought it would be helpful to highlight that when we talk about theory more generally across academic disciplines, whether that's STEM or in the business school or many other disciplines in social science, theory really requires understanding why and how. Because we are usually, if we want to build a scientific understanding for a research question like why some firms succeed and others do not, it's almost as if in physics, for instance, in the day-to-day, like the way objects move is described by Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics is a theory because it's not just making predictions, but you also have Newton's laws of motion, and there's an explanation for why those predictions were made. So this is a hurdle that is often very difficult to tackle. So what people have done is, even though machine learning in its raw form is primarily predictive, not a causal model, economics and econometrics more specifically, there are some approaches that we can use to get closer to causality. So, in fact, this is very close to an example that Dr. Bhattacharya pointed out. The link between cigarette smoking and cancer that many of you may have heard of, people started noticing a correlation as early as, I believe, the first half of the 20th century. They found that people that smoked were likely to get lung cancer. But then a lot of people started saying, hey, wait a minute. People who smoke also lead certain lifestyles that make them more vulnerable to certain kinds of cancer. So it's not the smoking per se that is causing cancer. Maybe it's the lifestyles they are leading and other factors, like Dr. Bhattacharya was talking about the confounds, right? So there could be many confounds there. But the debate was eventually resolved by examining tar deposits in the lungs of people who smoked. So what they basically found was, in the statistical language, those tar deposits were mediating the link between smoking and lung cancer. Now that was pretty conclusive evidence that what we are looking at here is causation, because there's no other way you can get tar deposits in your lungs than if you smoke. I mean, people's lungs won't just fill up with tar deposits; they've got to come from somewhere. And if those tar deposits are leading to cancer, which they found, and it's really possible to establish in a statistically robust way that that's a mediation model that we are showing is holding up, then we are talking causation. Likewise, whenever we see a correlation, as we saw with the last talk, correlation is not the same as causation. The gold standard is essentially what is called a randomized trial, which is if you want to show that something leads to something else, you basically take two individuals or firms or whatever you're looking at, you give one of them the treatment, the other one doesn't get the treatment, and if the one that gets the treatment has the outcome you're looking for shows up, it's easier to believe that, there is some causality here. But that's not possible, right? I mean, if you're studying firm performance, which is what we study in my field, you cannot walk into a business and tell them, I'm someone studying this, so please undertake these actions so that we'll observe what happens. It's just impossible. So the good news is there are certain approaches in econometrics that try to overcome that hurdle by exploiting what are called natural experiments. So there are some situations that occur in our world that come, I would not say exactly, but reasonably close to something like a randomized trial, and if you can take advantage of that, that's how you go from correlation to causality. You take one step forward in your understanding. There's just some glare, but it's fine. sorry. Yeah. So the other approach that people have taken is essentially to combine correlational studies which might use machine learning with experiments. And so some of you may already be familiar with this terminology, but internal validity refers to the extent, is what we would call causation and establishing. That is a fancier term for it. But external validity refers to the extent to which you can generalize from what you see in the lab to a field or a real world setting. And there's always a trade-off between the two because internal and external validity, often the methods that help with internal validity do not help with external validity and vice versa. So if you're conducting an experiment with human beings, which people often do with IRB approval, you can always argue that that's the behaviors they displayed in an experimental setting, but you know what? In the real world, that's not the way they're going to behave. So there's always that, even though in terms of internal validity, it's really very high because you showed causation in the lab. So there's always that trade-off, and people have come up with creative approaches, including combining studies as well as what are called field experiments. But in a nutshell, this particular piece, approach one to tackling uncertainty, is essentially using machine learning while building a causal element into it in some way. I mean, something that will help us get closer to causality. Now, approach 2, I actually have a foot in both of these approaches in my research, but I tend to emphasize approach 2 a bit more, is rather than use machine learning, one way of using algorithms to gain understanding of something that exhibits a lot of uncertainty is we dynamically simulate that model or that phenomenon that we are interested in. So what that basically means is, if we are interested in understanding how, for example, a firm's performance will turn out to be given different conditions, you can actually simulate those behaviors on your. You might sometimes need a supercomputer depending on what kind of simulation you are looking for. You're looking at, but you can often simulate those behaviors and study outcomes under different conditions and different combinations of parameters. So this is a completely different way of using algorithms, because here it is not really a predictive model. Rather, it's in a way you're modeling the actual phenomenon you're studying. You are treating it as if you have complete control, and you can essentially play with your model and determine outcomes. Now, there are some challenges here. Couple of challenges. The first, like I mentioned, the first challenge is external validity, which is sometimes your model exhibits behaviors, but people can always say that's not what is going to happen with a real business. There's a second kind of challenge, which is that what we're interested in, which is firm performance, there's potentially so many things that can determine whether a business succeeds or fails that it's impossible to determine what the parameter should be or what you're gonna model. Because like the question I asked, what will Apple's stock price be 1 year from now? Anything right from the recent executive orders to how the economy does in Europe to anything you can think of might affect that figure, right? So how would you even decide what you're gonna model? Because potentially anything can impact. So what researchers generally do is this particular approach is a bit more limited in that you might decide to model specific aspects or specific dimensions of what you're interested in and simplify the problem a lot, which is what people use. So the specific algorithms that people have used, one of them is, it's called NK simulations, which is firms exist on a landscape with many peaks and valleys, and it's almost like each firm in an industry has found its own local peak. And then people use that model to understand what might happen to firms under different assumptions. The second, and these are just two examples because there's in fact many such, they're called canonical models, is what are called bandit models. These help us evaluate trade-offs, like for instance whether you should be engaging in R&D activity or more exploration as opposed to exploitation, or just getting the most out of your existing stock of resources and capabilities. So there are specific dimensions of the problem that you pick up, or you simplify the problem in a way that you can at least answer some questions around it. So going back to why algorithms are important, like I said, is just because we live in a world which is generally uncertain rather than risky. And the two approaches people can take to grapple with uncertainty, one of them is probably machine learning, which is inherently limited sometimes because of it's not as much emphasis on causality and more on prediction generally. So the second approach is to pick up specific parameters and a specific dimension of the problem that you then build a dynamic model to explore outcomes under different assumptions and combinations of parameters. Thank you very much.
No, no.
No.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there a way to? Because there's glare on the.
Yeah, I can move it
Yeah.
up.
And this is not the right, sorry, this is not
That's
the
not
right.
the right one?
No, this one is mine. This way? It's right in your eye. See the light.
Should have brought my sunglasses.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a glare on the screen though, we can see it.
No, there is still, there's.
Or lower.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where you had that was good.
this way?
Yeah. That's good. Oh, it doesn't.
Now it's in this one. Is that good or no? Alright, would you like to have it back? More.
The back, yeah. It doesn't need to be that far, just a little more
Okay.
that way.
Yeah, but what about?
That's pretty good, right?
Good.
Is that good for you?
How about, are you able to see this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's more important.
Yeah,
No,
we know
now you're
we're
right in
right
this,
now.
Okay.
Would it help you to sit here?
yeah, why don't you split?
No, I'll be okay. I'll be
Okay.
fine. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for these interesting remarks on algorithms. And my field is philosophy and ethics, so my interests lie in the ethical issues surrounding algorithms, and some of which are probably familiar to many of you. For example, it is kind of well known that algorithms sometimes produce outcomes that increase inequality, and that's because the data that is sometimes used to train these algorithms contains biases, racial, gender biases, and so on. So in computer science, right, the idea is garbage in, garbage out, right? If you use data that is biased, you're going to get results that are prejudiced or biased against certain groups. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I recommend that book, Algorithms of Oppression, by Safiya Noble. Very comprehensive and interesting about that problem. There's also ethical issues with algorithms surrounding privacy, because basically the business model of the internet nowadays is that we get free services, and in return we basically surrender our personal data to tech companies and other companies as well. So this has been called by Shoshana Zuboff and others surveillance capitalism, right? This idea that information, data is kind of the currency that drives the economy, and you pay for those services on the internet by giving companies your data, right? So that means that companies know a lot about you, right? They collect your personal information, and then they can use it to target you with specific ads and things like that. So that book about surveillance capitalism, very interesting as well. There's also the issue of opacity, or Dr. Bhattacharya kind of talked about this a little bit, which means that machine learning algorithms, deep learning algorithms, what people sometimes refer to nowadays as AI as well, are opaque to us. We don't know exactly what their inner workings are like. We don't know how exactly they produce the outputs that they produce. And so when you have systems like that that are being used to make important decisions, then it can undermine some of the democratic values that we cherish, like transparency and things like that. So Weapons of Mass Destruction, very important book about that. And then there's also the ethical issue of the environment and the effects of AI, machine learning, deep learning algorithms on the environment, because they require a lot of computational power, a lot of energy, a lot of clean water to cool the servers on which all these models run. So there's also an environmental effect that we have to think about if we are concerned about the environment and nature. So these are kinds of, I think, well-known ethical issues when it comes to algorithms. I want to present something else. So
how much money do you want to borrow?
2,000 please.
2,000. Computer says no.
Is there anything we can do? Well, maybe if I asked to borrow a bit less, I don't know, £1,500?
£1,500. Computer says no.
Can I go with the manager?
Computer says no.
So that's it? There's nothing you can do?
Give me a minute. Computer says no.
all right. So the question I would like you all to think about is whether the use of algorithms, such as in this context, when someone is trying to apply to get a loan, and the decision is being made by an algorithm, whether there you go. Thank you. Whether outsourcing and delegating these kinds of decisions to algorithms actually undermines our freedom. Because in this situation, the person at the bank basically delegated all the decision making to the machine, to the computer, to the algorithm, right? And then the person who was trying to apply for a loan had no recourse, right? They had nowhere to go after the bank said, the computer says no, right? So in that case, their ability to decide their own fate, to be the authors of their own destiny, to make their own rational, informed decisions has been undermined. Right? So in ethics, we refer to this as autonomy. Autonomy is a very important principle in ethics. And it says that we should respect people's self-determination and capacity for self-governance. That is to say, to make their own rational decisions, to decide their own fate, to be the authors of their own destiny. This is a very important principle in research ethics, for example, when scientists are doing research with human subjects, they have to inform them before they start the study or the clinical trial or whatever it is. They have to give them the proper information that these subjects need to know in order to make an informed decision as to whether or not they want to participate in the research. Withholding information would undermine the autonomy of those subjects, right? Because then they wouldn't be able to make an informed decision if they want to participate in the study or not. So that's what is meant by autonomy. And then,
It's the cycle.
yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. There we go, okay. And so in that example of applying for a loan and then being rejected or denied just because the algorithm's output is denied, then yes, there is an issue with bias, and we know based on studies and investigative reporting by journalists and others that people who are of a different minority group, for example, are more likely to be rejected for loans than others. But I think there is maybe an even deeper problem here, which is that when we are denied a loan or are subject to any other kind of decision made by a computer, a machine, or an algorithm, and there is no explanation and there is no reasoning behind that decision, precisely because the algorithm is kind of a black box, right? And there is no way of interpreting that outcome, then our autonomy is undermined, right? We have nowhere to go from there. We are stuck, right? That's why the CFPB at the time required companies that make decisions like giving out loans based on algorithms to provide an explanation as to why this decision has been made. But of course, now the CFPB is no more, so who knows what's going to happen then, right? Okay, so that's kind of the issue that I would like everyone to think about, right? If we value freedom, right? If we think that people should be able to make free, independent decisions, then we need to respect autonomy. And that means that we need to think about how algorithms can undermine our autonomy by our over-reliance on their decision-making. Right? So if we don't respect autonomy, if we fall back into this thinking that, you know, the computer said so, so it must be right, then the risk that we're running is the risk of automation bias, relying too heavily on decision-making by algorithms, which could sometimes have very consequential effects, even literally taking freedom away from people, right? So this happens when, for example, police departments rely too heavily on facial recognition technology and arrest people because the algorithm found a match between the suspect and a photo in a database. This is a case of a person who was falsely accused of a crime, right? The algorithm identified that person as the perpetrator of the crime, but it was a false identification by the algorithm. So The other risk that we're running, if we fall back into this thinking of the computer said so it must be right, this kind of automation bias becoming entrenched, is what's called in ethics agency laundering. And so that happens when companies, again, rely too heavily on decision making by algorithms, and then when something bad happens, then they don't take responsibility, they blame the computer, so to speak, right? So in this cartoon, right, someone is getting fired, right, and the boss says, no, I didn't fire you, it was the algorithm, right? So that's agency laundering, right? And we saw that happening when Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta Platforms, right, the company that owns Facebook and others, went before Congress, and the people in attendance were parents whose young children were hurt by Instagram, Facebook, and other social media platforms because of the way in which these algorithms operate. They make content that is harmful to young people more available, right? The algorithm recommends, for example, for young girls, all kinds of beauty-related videos and photos that create this kind of unrealistic image of what a woman should look like. And unfortunately, some young people harm themselves and even take their own lives as a result of that. So that was that hearing, and Mark Zuckerberg, although he apologized to the parents of those young people that were hurt, he didn't take responsibility, right? He didn't say that Meta is going to do anything about it to try to address the harm that was done. So that's, I think, an ethical issue with algorithms that is worth thinking about, right? This idea that algorithms, if we rely on them too heavily, might actually undermine our autonomy, and we might end up in a situation where we live in a society that is an autocracy, right? So ruled by algorithms, right? And our masters, the Leviathan, right? Like in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, are not rulers or kings, but they are machines or algorithms that dictate every part of our lives. Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much for being here. I think someone's going to regret giving me this mic. I actually have everything written up, which is good because we don't have a ton of time, so I tend to ramble, and so I'm not going to ramble. I've really appreciated the remarks so far. One of my big takeaways is to stop smoking. Just, that was a joke. Okay. All right. Okay, so as a literature scholar, one of the things I'm interested in is how literature is created. Oh, you gave me a faulty. Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. That's my fault. Not the outro.
Yeah, okay. I'll let you know. All right. So one of the things I'm interested in is how literature is created. Although the answer varies in different historical and cultural moments, in the 21st century US, we generally understand there to be some interactions between what authors write, what publishers will publish, and what readers will read. What readers will read has traditionally been measured by sales numbers or reviews in newspapers. Of course, there are a lot of other factors that can influence the literary marketplace, censorship and book banning, for example, or changes to the cost of book production, which in our history usually happens during wartime, but can also happen due to tariffs. Happy Liberation Day, by the way. In general, though, we understand authors to be writing for a particular audience whose interests are usually mediated by publishers. So this is sort of a classic diagram of book history studies. It shows the traditional trajectory of a book. It goes from the author to the publisher, to the printer, to the shipper, to the bookseller, to the reader, who then may or may not also become an author. So with the rise of Amazon, who is now the largest bookseller in the US, we have to consider a new actor in the literary marketplace, namely algorithms, and particularly search and recommendation algorithms. How many of you have ever bought a book on Amazon? How many of you have never bought a book on Amazon? Wow, Nancy! Gold star. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about a couple of ways that Amazon's use of algorithms changes the literary marketplace and why we should care. All right, Amazon gives us access to more books than we've ever had before, which is why, in addition to convenience, many of us shop there. A small independent bookstore might be able to carry 50,000 books, and you all will barely be able to see this, but that's the small orange rectangle in the bottom right. Mega stores like Barnes & Nobles are able to carry about 150,000 books. That's the somewhat larger, 3 times as large, rectangle, blue rectangle on that side. Amazon carries 20 million titles in the US alone, so that's the gray rectangle, which you should all be able to see. But how are you going to find a book that might interest you out of 20 million options? Actually, I think I can actually hit it. Okay. So this is where, this is where search and recommendation algorithms come in. They can take your inputs along with data they've collected from your clicking and scrolling and provide you with some options. So this is like me standing naked in front of you, right? This is my Amazon bookstore page, the one associated with my IP address, so don't read too much into this. In fact, slide.
Okay,
So the scholar John Thompson compares this to looking for books in a warehouse using a pen light. He says, in the world of algorithm-driven recommendations, it is Amazon, not you, that controls the pen light, decides when to turn it on and where to point it and when to turn it off again. So there's something paradoxical here, right? Amazon provides us access to a huge amount of books, but it only shows us an extremely small fraction of them, far fewer than the amount we would be able to see in a bookstore. So, how does Amazon decide where to point the pen light? Algorithms are programmed with particular aims in mind. They then attempt to reach these aims by presenting the user with certain options or outputs. If those don't work, it will have learned something and adjust its future outputs to better reach those aims. You heard a much more eloquent description of this earlier tonight. We might imagine that the aims of Amazon's algorithms are to sell books. But historically, books have been loss leaders for Amazon, meaning they don't make much, if any, profit. Instead, algorithms are programmed with the aim of keeping users on the site, spending more time producing more data. These data are sometimes called captivation metrics. Data can be bought and sold and used for advertising and to improve the performance of the algorithms. So while you might think you're receiving personalized book selections that you might like reading, what you might actually be receiving is options intended to keep your eyes trained on the screen. So these algorithms are constantly learning, by which I mean updating their models of both the books they are recommending and the users they're recommending them to. Amazon's algorithms group books together based on a number of different data points, usually provided by publishers, like genre, author's name, date of publication, etc. This information is usually called metadata. Which of these data points are most likely to indicate that a book is similar to another book is determined by a statistical model trained on our clicks. This is called item-to-item filtering. So, for example, if you like a book by Stephen King, you're more likely to click on another book of horror than you are to click on another book by an author named Stephen. This is how the algorithms learn that author names don't create good book groups. Of course, bookstores also sort books, just like libraries do, but the logic they use to do so is extremely visible to us by scanning the shelves. The ways that algorithms group books, as we could see represented in this image, would be less understandable to us. This is the opacity that was already talked about today. This is, in fact, the advantage of using algorithms, right? They can model relationships too complex for us to understand. But algorithms don't only make groupings of books, they also make groupings of us. Using our data profiles and preferences, algorithms segment their users to produce better recommendations. This is called collaborative filtering. This is how Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, describes collaborative filtering. It is a statistical technique that looks at your past purchase streams and finds other people whose past purchase streams are similar. Think of the people it finds as your electronic soulmates. Then we look at that aggregation and see what things your electronic soulmates have bought that you haven't. Those are the books we recommend, and it works. So there's a lot going on here that we could talk about. But yeah, one of the things I would ask is whether those soulmates have souls or whether they are just data points on one of those grids. All right, so when you're scrolling and clicking on Amazon, next slide, please. Thank you. When you're scrolling and clicking on Amazon, it seems like you are completely in control, right? You get to decide whether you click on a recommended book or one of the top search results or not. But like in a choose-your-own-adventure book, the options that are given to you are fairly limited. So this is a screenshot of a book page on Amazon. With each click I make, or even with prolonged scrolling, right, which can be timed and collected as data, I am providing Amazon with a clearer idea of who I am as a book buyer and what other book buyers I am similar to. In this way, the choices algorithms give us discipline us into certain categories, right? Romance reader, horror reader, nonfiction reader, and then gives us options accordingly. As an algorithm researcher, Mike Anani writes, efficient and scalable systems require stable categories of people who have learned to say certain words, click certain sequences, and move in predictable ways. Slide. So part of this stability is the enormous amount of historical data that Amazon has amassed on its own site and two of the sites that it now owns, which is Goodreads and AbeBooks. This means that each new piece of data it collects from us becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of the whole. So research by a scholar named Ed Finn has shown that historical school syllabi are etched into the data that Amazon's algorithms rely on to recommend books. So as syllabi might change in the real world due to historical changes, recommendations are much slower to respond because each new bit of data is a decreasing percentage of the whole. So in this slide, this is that one. This is from the book page of The Great Gatsby, which tells us that books similar to The Great Gatsby include books like Othello and Romeo and Juliet. I mean, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I would venture to guess that the main similarity that they have is that they are, both taught frequently and bought by students, maybe together. Slide. Of course, what I've talked about so far doesn't yet take into account that Amazon accepts money from publishers in order to feature their books more prominently in search results and recommendations. So if a publisher refuses to pay this fee, Amazon manipulates its algorithms to stop recommending books by particular publishers, which can cause sales to drop by as much as 40%. Although algorithmic results may appear objective and automatic, they are easily corruptible, seeming to show a mirror of your preferences or the general demands of readers when they're actually a symptom of Amazon's business deals. Slide. So algorithms have a particular logic. Their logic values pre-programmed aims like captivating users, optimizing the number of clicks to get us what we're looking for, and disciplining users into recognizable categories. So algorithms change not only how books are bought and sold, but also what books are bought and sold. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, a change in what audiences read will have an effect also on what authors will write and what publishers will publish. So I'm going to end with a couple of examples of this happening. One of these, and this is, I'm sure, going to become extremely annoying, so I'm going to switch to the next slide very shortly. One is Amazon itself. Amazon has 13 different publishing imprints, and they choose what to publish using the data produced in the interactions between users and algorithms. This means that the books produced by Amazon imprints are designed specifically to be read and marketed to those segments of users that have been created by the algorithms themselves. So you can see that in the way that the imprints are organized, right? Like one for romance, one for mystery, etc. Right? So it's like producing the product for the consumer segments that it itself has created. Slide. The nonfiction publishing company Callisto Media is another example. Callisto collects the search terms suggested by Amazon. So when you start typing in Amazon search bar and it suggests a couple of options for you, Callisto goes through and it clicks on those and it finds ones that don't return any results. And then it publishes books that will fit into those search queries. So according to the CEO, Benjamin Wayne, editors, quote, pick a winner 3% of the time. Here, again, algorithmically processed data is shaping what is published. Slide. Okay, so why does it matter that algorithms are shaping our literary landscape? Doubtlessly, there are a lot of arenas in which algorithmic intervention matters more, and you've heard about many of them tonight, right? The setting of health insurance premiums, jail sentences, police surveillance, etc. But I think it matters here too. A lot of our formal education involves discovering or learning universal laws, right? We talked about cause and effect tonight. We talked, interestingly, about Newtonian mechanics, formulas, etc., right? Cultural production, including literary production, doesn't work like that, right? If you've made a satisfactory meaning out of one book, the one thing you can be sure of is that the next book won't follow those same laws. Right? Each book is a new experience, and each unique reader, to some extent, reads a different book. As you may have experienced yourselves, right, even reading the same book twice often yields different results. So unlike nomothetic disciplines that try to discover general laws and principles, literary study, along with the study of art and culture and music, tries to understand and make meaning of unique instances. So literary study has historically valued the idiosyncratic, right, that which does not fit into the well-defined group. And the new, the creation of something that is unlike something that we've seen before. Algorithmic logics, on the other hand, tend toward privileging stasis, as we saw with those syllabi, and the ease of categorization. So in conclusion, this is sort of tongue-in-cheek, in conclusion, I suppose it sounds like I'm saying not to buy books on Amazon, which I am, but what I'm hoping you take away from my remarks is the idea that the humanities offer a valuable way of understanding the world, namely as a series of unique instances. Although search and recommendation algorithms appear to address each of us individually, they're ultimately categorizing tools that, on Amazon's site, shape us into optimal book buyers. As algorithms start intruding on so many parts of our lives, including now our reading lives, right, one of the places that Amazon tracks our data in order to recommend books to us is on the Kindle, we need to protect and nurture ways of thinking in ourselves and for all of us, right, and our students, that allow us to critique algorithmic outputs and understand that there are other legitimate ways of valuing, ordering, and understanding the world. Thank you.
Project. Oh, there we go. Thank you. That was fantastic. So much great information. Sometimes I think that we and I complain about technology a lot, but sometimes I wonder, technology doesn't necessarily do new things. So I was just thinking about Anna's thing about publishers paying Amazon to get promoted. Same thing, you go to the grocery store. The food that's at the eye level, they've paid more to be at that place on the shelf, right? Because they know people are going to grab that. But it's just like the technology, maybe it just makes it more efficient, right? And faster in kind of more places than just a physical grocery store. And I'm always struck too by the social media algorithms and going on to spending too much time on Instagram and clicking on something and then watching as like similar posts just sort of start to fill my feed like instantly, and I kind of find it funny and sort of game it and try to see how long it takes to fill up with certain kinds of posts. But there is a thing, if you're 10, 11, 12 years old, you're just trying to figure out the world, who you are, and if you start getting flooded with this kind of information, it really can change and sort of, I shouldn't say change, but influence to a very, very great degree, inform who you are as a person, which can have negative consequences as well. So really, really amazing. Good talk. We have a few minutes. Is there any sort of questions anybody would like to ask? Any comments, anything at all? Yes, sir.
So mainly for the first two speakers talking about machine learning and AI and the tremendous number of variables depending on the scenario and what you're applying that technology to, I'm curious to hear any comments about something we hear about periodically in the news, which is driverless or self-driving cars, where you have so many variables and the outcome of the decisions that are being made could be catastrophic.
Yeah, so as part of applying machine learning to these safety critical systems, we need to use a more cautious approach. And in that, a lot of work is happening where they target more contingency management based approaches, where as part of the safety assurance, thinking about what are some of the unsafe maneuvers that the car could make, such as tries to turn more than 90 degrees all of a sudden. And can we identify those and try to stop that from happening through more of safety assurance approaches? So yes, it's a very difficult problem to solve, but that's where we need to start thinking about what are some of the failures that could occur and how we could prevent that. And that is where, how can we architect software? How can we let the human know that, oh, I am less confident of my decision right now, right? Because earlier it has happened where the car rammed into a trailer thinking that, oh, it was a sky. It failed, it never knew. And that's where we need to perform more rigorous testing and perform what are known as cross data set analysis. That means looking into different data sets, training on one, testing on another, through that trying to find out where does it fail. Through that, coming up with more software architectures that would prevent catastrophic actions from being taken. But that's one approach.
Absolutely, and just to add on to that, like he was pointing out, the consequences of making a mistake are really different from field to field. I mean, in my field, no one is going to die if you make a mistake. You lose money, which is pretty bad. I mean, you don't want to lose money, but you won't kill anyone even if you make a mistake. So that basically determines sometimes how these algorithms are used, because your tolerance for those mistakes, for example, heuristic approaches are quite popular among academics in trying to understand why some firms are successful and others are not. You cannot make a precise prediction, but you can have an idea that certain approaches and certain actions you take as a decision maker impact you positively or negatively. It's okay to have an approximate idea sometimes. So, like he was pointing out, you can't do that with autonomous vehicles because you just can't kill someone, even if that's just one person. If that algorithm is making just one mistake and someone died, that's a problem. But like I said, I think varies from field to field, and that impacts how these algorithms are set up and used.
Anything else? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So yeah, sorry, can I go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay, hi, it was fascinating talk, although I missed the first few minutes of it. I did hear Dr. Bhattacharya's piece. I wanted to comment on, just pick your brains on something slightly outside the immediate realm of this discussion, and that is the problem of the public understanding or the widespread understanding of these issues, right? I mean, if you look at ourselves here, we are inside a university campus, people who must be at some level invested into it because we gathered here after working hours 6 to 8 and only a handful of people, right? But these issues that we just talked about, and almost all of them hit on ethics and the ramification of these extremely powerful algorithms on manipulating our behaviors, limiting our options, and all that. I'm just curious to know, what does the panel feel about the prospects or possibilities of making this better understood by the consumers, by the public at large, instead of just, outside, crossing the boundaries of just academic interests?
Well, I could start talking about that. I mean, I think that's one of my arguments is for algorithmic literacy, right, as some people call it. And I think that's really important. In some ways, we have a lot of algorithmic literacy, right? Like as Jason was saying, we know that when we click online, things happen, right? There are effects of that. But I think one of the things, so again, right, the implications vary from field to field. Again, I'm talking about literary production, which is small potatoes, but it's also important if we don't want all of our culture to be shaped by the decisions that algorithms tell us to make. So, in my research, what I found is that when people are asked about this, they often have two responses to algorithmic recommendations. They either are like, yes, this knows me so well, or I'll use the words from the research itself, go home algorithm, you're drunk, right? Like, you don't know me at all. So what it ends up being is just people sort of evaluating themselves based on what algorithmic recommendations they get. And the danger with that, I think, is that you start thinking, if the algorithms have a lot of data on you and seem to be giving you good recommendations, if suddenly they give you a recommendation that you're not comfortable with, you think, well, maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I'm wrong, maybe the algorithm is right. Maybe I do want to read this book, even though I have no idea why it was recommended to me. And who are you then anymore? And so I think that, so I think that maybe the stakes are somewhat low, but I think for buying books on Amazon, but I think, like what Modi was talking about, right, they're not low if we think about the larger scope of how many of our decisions are starting to be made in this way. And I think it's probably one of the most important things is that we start realizing how much of our lives are being influenced in this way.
Yeah, so I think it is a very complex problem to take it outside the university, because as more and more society gets involved in using social media and using the internet and go with the recommendations, they start believing in whatever is being told to them, and it's a recommendation based on whatever they have seen. So you start thinking one way and cannot come out of that. So as a society, I think it needs to be addressed from a more broader perspective as to be, how can we get back to where we are open to other viewpoints and agree to disagree in a professional way, such that we understand these algorithms are pushing to us what we are believing in, and not in other aspects that we should open our mind to. So, yeah, it's a complex problem to address.
One last question.
One I probably shouldn't ask. Is Elon Musk using a lot of algorithms to make cuts?
Government, right? Cutting jobs is
Cutting jobs.
I honestly, I really don't know exactly what algorithms he used, so it's difficult for me to comment. Very broadly, I think that something that all four panelists kind of got at was that these algorithms are generally predictive, but there's less of a sense of why and how that the person that's using the algorithm gets. You don't get a sense of the why and the how. So if Elon Musk used those algorithms to make job cuts, which of course he probably did, it's in fact difficult to comment on that for that very reason. It's something all four panelists, so it might help sometimes, even though machine learning algorithms by their nature are predictive, there are certain types, there is some causal inference available within machine learning, and it might help to try to get at the why and the how, and I think that will kind of convince people a bit, do a better job of convincing people that those cuts were fair and needed. But other than that, it's hard for, but I'll leave it to my fellow panelists.
Can algorithms be adapted to include a human element? Because basically the Musk thing is find wherever you think waste is, but ignore everything downhill from that. So all of the human element that doesn't make business sense, but makes human sense in the way that it treats people around the world has been ignored by the algorithm. But can algorithms be taught to include that?
Yeah, it could be taught, programmed to include ethical values. But the thing is, to answer your question, I don't know what if he used any algorithms, but the approach is like disrupt everything and then start seeing what you need. Or the other approach is take a more normal, regularized approach over time, trying to find out what needs to be cut, which is a more slower and a regular approach instead of the disruption. But I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. That question of human intervention in the algorithm is interesting. So my research extends beyond the search and recommendation algorithms on Amazon's site, and is also about how algorithms regiment Amazon warehouses. And there, there's, I don't know if you've heard about this in the news, but Amazon workers have been trying to unionize, for example. In Minnesota warehouse, the workers walked out, and Amazon came to the negotiating table and said the one thing that could not be negotiated was the rate, which the rate is the speed at which workers are told to pick items off the shelves or pack the items or unload the items. And so they have scan guns that show them exactly how many seconds they have to do each of these tasks. And these are like so this is sort of where all the clicks we make online have their effect, right, in the material world. And there's this, this sense of needing to increase the speed all of the time. And they said they could not change the rate because the rate is objective, algorithmically determined, and they can't affect it. If they affected the entire global logistical process would break down. And so this is like I see this as a repeated appeal to this sort of, the power and knowledge that the algorithm has, that if we intervene, if we mere humans intervene in it, right, it will break and fall apart because that's not how it's intended. But of course, on the site, Amazon manipulates its algorithms all the time. And so this is maybe a faulty appeal to the algorithm's superiority. Yeah.
I will just add that unfortunately, it seems like as a society we've already decided that hiring is something that algorithms can do, and firing too, hiring and firing. So when I talk to my students, right, they always complain about how applying for every job today, first you have to do a litany of tests online, which are just designed to collect data on you, and then if the your resume passes the algorithm gateway, then it gets to be inspected by an actual human being. So unfortunately, it seems like that ship has sailed, and it's not just Elon Musk, right? Companies all over the place are hiring and firing using algorithms. Where I'm a little bit more optimistic is I hope that we will decide as a society, and think about this very carefully, that there are some decisions that we do not want algorithms to make, right? Such as the decision to fire a weapon, right? So some optimism there, maybe.
Well, a lot of federal workers are avoiding any DEI references when they're reporting their last 3 weeks of what they did or whatever period of time it is that they are supposed to report on.
Yeah.
They avoid every word that could be regarded as a DEI word, which, it's algorithm.
Well, and that's really interesting too, because that's an example of systems gaming in a way. So that's the way that we change our behaviors, right, to avoid detection, for example, by an algorithm. And so, like, in very real ways, we all the time, I don't know, I'm sure you all have done this on Amazon, where you put in a search term, it doesn't return the right results or whatever, maybe you're clicking around, and then you're in your mind, right, you sort of know the algorithm exists. This is called like the algorithmic gaze, right, like you are operating with the consciousness that you are interacting with the algorithm, and it's shaping how you're behaving.
So interesting, going back to Modi's point about hiring and firing, I know a person who works at a search firm, and talking just a few years ago about how algorithms scan the resumes that come in, right? If they don't have the right kind of keywords they're looking for, you're not going to make it past that. And so people were taking their resume and putting the right keywords all over it, and then in white fonts. So if you looked at it, you couldn't see these words. but this machine that was reading it would pick up those words and say, oh wow, this person, this word is mentioned 25 times. So we're a little past 8 o'clock, so I want to thank our panel once again. To thank you all for coming out. There's still some refreshments over there. Please help yourself. And we've got some goodies over here for our 40th anniversary as well. So